We're going to get started. My name is Stephen Levine. I serve as Associate Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center here at the University of Montana. It is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Andrew J. Nathan back to the University of Montana. He was first here in 1989 for the Mansfield Center Conference, Rising Expectations in China and Human Rights. It is our great good fortune to have him with us tonight as the final speaker in this year's President's Lecture Series. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank President George Dennison for his support of the series during his remarkable 20 years of service to the University of Montana. My marching orders are that this introduction should be short and pertinent. I could simply say that Professor Nathan is widely recognized as one of the world's leading experts on Chinese politics, and leave it at that. But this would be too short and verge on the impertinent. A bit of background. The tight-knit band of graduate students in Chinese studies at Harvard University in the 1960s that included Professor Philip West and myself already recognized Andrew Nathan as the brightest star among us. That early promise has been fully realized in Professor Nathan's impressive career at Columbia University, where he is the class of 1919 Professor of Political Science. Through numerous path-breaking articles, essays, chapters, and books on many aspects of Chinese domestic politics, foreign policy, and society, Professor Nathan has made indelible contributions to both scholarly and public understanding of China. His analyses are always sharp and focused, his judgment sound, his prose crystal clear. Among his many book-length works are Chinese Democracy, China's Crisis, China's Transition, The Great Wall and the Empty Fortress, and the Tiananmen Papers, the latter co-edited with Professor Perry Link. But Andrew Nathan is not simply a prolific scholar and a superb teacher. As a public intellectual, he embodies the qualities that constitute the ancient sage Confucius's definition of a gentleman or superior person, a junzi in Chinese, of which the most important is run or humaneness. Professor Nathan's is a leading voice in the international struggle to promote human rights in China. He serves as co-chair of the organization Human Rights in China and is outspoken in his defense of the too many victims of human rights abuses in the People's Republic of China. Indeed, because of his human rights advocacy and his role in editing the Tiananmen Papers, the authentic record of the secret high-level deliberations that led to the June 4th massacre in 1989, the Chinese government has banned Professor Nathan from visiting the PRC. Fortunately, the truths that Professor Nathan tells cannot be silenced by vindictive authoritarians. Tonight, he will address the timely issue of U.S.-China relations by delivering the Lucille Speer Memorial Lecture on the topic, Does the Rise of China Threaten American Interests? Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew J. Nathan to our campus and our community.
Thank you, Steve. That's a very, very warm introduction, and I want to acknowledge Phil West down here, who was a fellow graduate student with Steve and me at Harvard and who's had a distinguished career and continues to do so here at the University of Montana. And thank you all for coming on this lovely spring night. And thank you to Jane Dennison as well for hosting the dinner before. Now that's enough thank yous. I don't have too much time. So the topic is the rise of China and whether it poses a threat to the United States. And the first part of that topic, the rise of China, I think all of us are very familiar with in our daily lives. We're purchasing a lot of Chinese products. I was told at dinner that Montana is exporting a lot of wheat to China. China's holding a lot of American foreign exchange and American assets. I want to get the right relationship to this microphone. I hear my voice coming back. We have to negotiate with China to solve the problems of North Korea, Iran, the climate, and so forth. Obviously, China has become a major power. Some people say it's the number 2 power in the world, more important than Russia, Japan, India, or the EU. Some people think it's going to become the largest economy in the world in some 2 or 3 decades from now. The rise of China, I think we all know and we all experience it. The puzzle is about the threat. What is that threat? I hear a lot of questions when I speak to audiences. Does China pose a threat? And that's what I would like to analyze tonight. And the way that I'd like to do it is to break it into 2 big parts. One is now, and the other one is the future. And so I'll start with now, and to break the now part of it into 2 parts, which is to start by looking at the thing from China's point of view, so that we should transport our thinking, if you will, over to Beijing, to the party headquarters, and think about their global strategy, where they are on the map of the globe, and what they think their security issues are, and how they've oriented themselves to the world, and then turn it around and say, what does all that mean to us? That's the now part of it, and then I'll get into the future part of it. So, transport yourselves, if you can, to Beijing, to Zhongnanhai, the party headquarters, maybe to a meeting of the Foreign Affairs Work Group of the top party leadership, and you're talking about China's security issues and China's security strategy. I teach a course on Chinese foreign policy at Columbia, and I tell my students to think about this issue by thinking about 4 concentric rings of security issues that you have to solve if you're a security policymaker in China. The first ring is actually inside the borders of China. And you might want to compare, as I speak about this, the security issues that American policymakers have to face. If we think about the security issues that we face inside our national borders, we want to prevent terrorism, and perhaps we want to consider immigration as a security issue, if you wish to think of it in that light. For China, the picture is much more challenging within their national borders. Within the national borders of China, there's a large part of China on the, let me see, I want to pretend I have a map here and make sure I'm looking at it the right way. There's a part over on the east side of China, the east coast, as well as the central part of China, is where the great bulk of the 1.3 billion Chinese are living, crowded in, very intensive agriculture and intensive big cities. The Han, ethnic Han people, the ones that we think of ethnically as, real Chinese, are living in this area. And as a security planner, you're facing all kinds of security issues within that population, because there's been tremendously rapid change and modernization going on for the last 30 or so years. And so many people have benefited, but at the same time, many people have moved around. They've lost their social moorings, they've lost land, they've lost jobs, they've lost their access to the kind of health care that they had under the old socialist system in China. Many people have suffered from corruption, many people have grievances, and so there's a disorderly society that you get when there's a tremendous amount of change, with lots of riots, demonstrations, petitioners, complaints on the internet, people listening to foreign radio, people organizing to do environmental work, and so forth and so forth, so that the regime views this as a security issue, partly because it's set up as an authoritarian regime, so it views all of those problems not as problems that can be solved by opening up for discussion and freedom, but as challenges that need to be repressed. They have all kinds of religious movements that the government doesn't authorize, and so forth. Then, as you move over to the western part of the map of China, you have these vast territories that are very important for you as a security planner to control. Tibet and Xinjiang. You have to control them because they're more than half of your national territory, and they buffer off some of your challenging countries, India, Russia, the Central Asian countries, but living in those areas are populations, the Tibetans in Tibet, and not only in Tibet, but Tibetan populations in other parts of China around the piece of the map that we know as Tibet, a larger Tibet. And then in Xinjiang, several minority populations, the largest of which are the Uyghurs, who are a Turkic rather than a Chinese ethnic people. They're Muslims, and many of them feel that they really should belong to a larger, what they call Turkestan, that would be an independent Uyghur domain that would stretch over parts of China as well as parts of Central Asia. And you need to control those territories. And again, the way that the regime has solved that problem is largely through repression, military occupation, and then moving a lot of Han Chinese in there and trying to economically develop these regions so as to, they hope, assimilate the minority populations through economic development. So you have a lot of your time and attention and your resources tied up within your national borders in a way that's not true of American security planners. And it's interesting that while the American military is designed with, I think, 6 global commands, the Pacific Command, the Central Command, the Africa Command, and so forth, the Chinese military is organized in 7 military regions that are disposed across the map of China. They're all deployed in China because the military has to be used in certain cases to deal with civil unrest, as we've seen recently in Tibet and Xinjiang, but we've seen over the years even in other parts of China, such as Beijing itself in 1989. Then you look at the borders of China, what I tell my students to think of as the second ring. And China is surrounded by, I forget the number now, I have it in my longer notes in my pocket, I think 19, I always forget numbers, countries on its border. We have 2 countries. The countries that are on our border, you know what they are. The countries that are on China's border include such, challenging partners as Russia, Japan, India, Vietnam, Korea, countries in many cases with which China has actually fought wars in the last, say, century, if you want to go back less than a century, to Japan invading China in the 1930s. They fought a war with India, they fought a war with Vietnam, they fought couple of border skirmishes with Russia. This is not Canada and Mexico. These are large countries with large militaries, with histories of animosity to China. And because of the history of China's emergence into the international system, most of these borders were disputed with these countries. And it remains the case that a number of important borders have not been settled, including in the South China Sea. Large parts of the South China Sea that are contested between China and a number of its neighbors, most importantly Vietnam. And each of those countries presents very complex security and foreign policy issues. Right now, we cannot really think of a war between China and Russia, or really between China and India, or China and Vietnam. But the reason why those kinds of wars, or Japan, are not probable in the foreseeable future is not because they have no basis, but it is because the Chinese, as well as the other partners across the border, have invested a lot of effort in managing those bilateral relations. Their relations with Russia have absorbed a huge amount of their effort, and they continue to have military preparedness to deal with contingencies on all of these borders. Their relationships with Japan have tied up a huge amount of their effort and continue to be a major diplomatic challenge as Japan and China try to maneuver with one another to both feel safe when the other guy is so close. And then I ask my students to think about the third ring of Chinese security. And I tell them that the third ring is the second ring plus. That is to say that the third ring is a number of regional systems that surround China. This is a problem that the United States doesn't really have. I mean, Canada is just Canada. But if you think about China's relationship, for example, with a country like North Korea, which is, as we know, a very, very difficult country to figure out and to deal with, and it's actually equally difficult for the Chinese to figure out and deal with North Korea, and they're right next to it. And whatever happens there can have a profound effect on the interests of China. But whenever they deal with North Korea, it's a regional issue. They have to think about South Korea. They have to think about Japan. They have to think about Russia. They have to think about the United States, which has its interests. All of these countries have very pressing national security interests tied up in North Korea, so that no one country can just deal with North Korea in isolation. That's why we have around the Korea problem something called the six-party talks, because there are 6 parties that are engaged in that region. And one of those 6 parties that's engaged in that region is not actually in the region, and that's the United States. The United States has reached across the Pacific to establish and assert a national security interest on China's borders, not something that we experience. There isn't any outside power that's reaching across the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean and expressing its primary national security interest in either Canada or Mexico. So we don't have to think that way. That's Northeast Asia. Then we have to look at Southeast Asia, which is a very complicated package. They have the 10 countries, so-called ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, which have they collaborate together in trying to present a common front to China on issues like the South China Sea. They collaborate together to try to present a policy toward a country like Burma. China has to worry about Vietnam in the context of ASEAN. It has to worry about Burma in the context of ASEAN. Then you have the South Asian regional system, which is very complicated. Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan all have to be looked at together. And the Central Asian regional system, where China's relationships with neighboring countries like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan are shadowed over by the interests of Russia and the United States. In each of these regions around China, the United States is a major actor, thanks to our power reach into the global level. So the Chinese security planner then looks to the fourth ring, which is the rest of the world: Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, in particular Europe. In that ring, China doesn't have the same kinds of security interests that it has in the first 3 rings. That is to say, it doesn't have a military presence. It's not militarily affected by, let's say, changes of government, by civil wars that may occur in these regions. However, as China's economy has grown, China has developed important national interests in these other areas, and they are, first of all, economic. So China's economy growing has given China a huge appetite for resources. Oil we know about, but also iron ore, copper, every kind of mining product. And it's hard to go out into the world market and develop commodity sources at that scale that the huge Chinese economy requires. And they've had to really look and scratch around and find places to get it. And they don't totally, let's just talk about oil for the moment as an example of this process. They don't completely believe in the market. the oil market. They know that the oil market is very, very heavily influenced by politics, that the United States is quite dominant, that the United States has a lot of equity oil. We own a lot of, or co-own a lot of oil fields. So if you said to the Chinese, relax, don't bother about Iran or the Sudan, you can go on the market any day and buy oil, they would not consider that as compatible with national energy security. So they have gone out, they've certainly gone to the market, but at the same time have gone out to try to develop equity ownership of certain energy resources around the world. And again, it's not just energy, but I'm just using that example, but it's the same thing with iron, with copper, with rare earths, with all kinds of products. And so they've looked for oil fields that France and the United States and the Dutch and others don't already own or co-own, and they've found them in places like the Sudan, like Angola, like Iran, like Venezuela, and they've gone into those countries and developed a large stake, which then entangles them in political issues that they hadn't thought about at first. The issue of the Iranian nuclear weapon, the issue of the Sudan, genocide and so forth, the issue of Chavez's relations with the United States. So that's one exposure that they have in the fourth ring, and then they also are concerned with, as they emerge as a world power, with having good relations with each of the 200 or so governments around the world, because you often need them to vote for you or with you in trade negotiations and in multilateral negotiations, climate, human rights, economic, and so forth and so forth. So they have a strong diplomatic interest there, but they don't have an actual military security position in the fourth ring. So what I would say about this first point is that the Chinese security planner faces a huge menu of pressing first-order challenges simply to protect the most basic elements of national security, which are territorial integrity, regime security, and economic security. And in that sense, I would say they're tied down with a complex set of problems. The second point that I want to bring out when you look at all these things from a China policymaker's point of view is the theme of interdependence. Under the old regime in China of Mao Zedong, China took the path of self-reliance, of autarky. It sort of cut itself off from the world. We, the United States, had a policy of containment and isolation that kind of encouraged China to cut itself off from the world. So Mao embraced that, if you will, opportunity or necessity, and China was very much isolated from the world. When Mao died, Deng Xiaoping eventually came to power and made a huge strategic reorientation. It took some years to unfold. It was not a clear blueprint at the very beginning, but what it turned out to be, starting from 1979 and kind of culminating in the 1990s, was a very deep engagement of China in the global system, in globalization. And globalization itself was a process that was accelerating and offering more and more opportunities to China in the 80s and 90s. China went global. They developed this huge export economy. They opened themselves up to foreign investment, to foreign travel, to all kinds of foreign presence there in the foundations, students, and so forth. They accumulated a huge trade surplus with us. For most of these years, they ran a balanced trade with the world. But a lot of manufacturing moved from other countries in Asia, from Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and so forth, over into China, where they proved to be surprisingly efficient and on time and surprisingly good quality very fast, so that our global trade deficit that we were running kind of migrated to one place, and that was to China. And they found themselves with all these dollars that they have now. And my message to you about what this looks like to a Chinese policymaker is the word interdependence. What they find is that in the Mao period, they were poor, but they were very independent. They could say, do whatever they wanted to do and insult the foreigners, and there was no economic cost to that. Today, they're extremely interdependent, and their economic model really depends on the ability to employ people, the ability to raise the living standards of people as time goes by, the ability to provide energy for that economy, to provide food for their people and stuff like that is very interdependent with us and with many other foreign economies, and so that they find themselves benefiting from this Deng Xiaoping strategy of embracing globalization, benefiting tremendously, their living standards going up, their military budget going up, their global prestige and clout going up, and yet at the same time paying a price. There's no free lunch, and the price is this interdependence, so that they can't just for example, in the issue of Taiwan, which I haven't mentioned yet, but which is an important issue between the U.S. and China. China can't just lob missiles at Taiwan as they did under Mao, not at Taiwan, but at the offshore islands, because they didn't have missiles with that range at that time. They can't just kick up a crisis in the Taiwan Strait because they're very interdependent with us. Now, if we turn this around and say, what does all that mean to us in terms of this question of the China threat? So we migrate ourselves back from Beijing and sit here in Missoula and say, well, now we're looking at the world from here, and what does it look like? I would suggest the following, first of all, kind of historical long-term perspective. I think many of you are old enough to remember Richard Nixon. I have light in my eyes, so I'm not sure. But before I came up here, it looked like some of you were that old. And I certainly am. And you'll remember that Nixon, you may not remember this detail, it's a detail beloved of China specialists, that before Nixon became president in the year 1967, he wrote an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs, in which he said that we cannot let China forever, how did he put it, live outside the family of nations, nurturing its hatreds and resentments, word to that effect. And he gave the rationale for what has come to be called the engagement policy with China, which is that we've got to reach out to China and invite them to join the world so that they can modernize and become more like us and understand our values and get a stake in the world system so that they won't be this huge undigested lump in the world system that presents a danger to the world system. That was Nixon's vision. And in fact, it was not only him, but a lot of people, including Phil and Steve and I at that time, were part of a small movement to think about re-engaging with China. And then Nixon did it, of course, as you know, in this 1972 visiting China, Shanghai, very dramatic. We watched it on TV. And subsequent presidents with ups and downs and ins and outs and rhetoric and so forth have basically stuck to Nixon's policy. And every president has said at some point or another in some speech, the stability and prosperity of China are in the national interest of the United States. And they believed that. And the argument was Nixon's argument. Now, many times Chinese, who are often suspicious of the intentions of American policy, since our policy is all around them, as I said, we're in their regions, don't quite believe it. They think this is a hypocrisy. But I think, they seem to think we want to hurt China, we want to hold China back. But I think, in fact, it has been American strategy and that's why we've opened our market to China. We've given free, fellowships for PhD education for tens of thousands of Chinese. We've transferred technology to the Chinese through foreign direct investment in China. We have done so much to not to take entire credit for China's rise, but along with the Chinese, we have, I think, done a great deal to facilitate China's rise because we wanted to get something out of it. And it seems to me that a lot of what we wanted to get out of it, we have gotten. China has essentially acquired a huge stake in the world system that the United States built, in the World Bank, in the IMF, in the WTO, in the arms control system that we created, in the banking system that we created. We didn't create it alone, but I don't have time to give credit to everybody to the Europeans and others, but it's essentially a US-designed post-World War II system that the Chinese have joined with both feet and both hands. They've joined all these institutions. They've signed all of the arms control treaties that we've asked them or allowed them to sign. They've signed many of the human rights treaties. They've joined the WTO. They have essentially become a status quo power. Now, their rise of China is not the status quo. That fact alone changes the status quo, but their interest is in the system. They are not a revolutionary power like the Soviet Union used to be, or like China used to be, or like Iran is today. They're not trying to change the rules of the international order. They've joined the international order. So we got most of what we wanted strategically, but at the same time, we got some things that we didn't quite anticipate. And one was this tremendous emergence of China. I mean, many have anticipated it. Napoleon is often quoted as saying, "When China awakes," I forget the exact quote, but it didn't take a nuclear scientist or whatever the cliche goes to foresee that if and when this vast country would get its act together, it would be a big player. Just demographically, this is inevitable, and yet we didn't quite think ahead, and I don't think we needed to think ahead in 1967 or 72, so many years ahead to what it would mean when China became a great power. So we got the status quo engagement. We also got something that we weren't quite planning for, which is the rise of China, but something that we didn't get, that we sort of hoped for and talked about a great deal, was the democratization of China. Here we got a surprise. We were expecting that as China's, living standards went up and China opened up to the Western world and China joined the international regimes and published a lot of laws and started to wear neckties instead of mouse suits and became more and more like us and drank Johnny Walker, that they would become democratic. They would change their regime. And they talked about it a lot, and they still do. We need to become democratic. But the reality is, as of now, they haven't become democratic. They've liberalized a lot. The personal life is much more free. They have courts, lawyers, and stuff like that. And in certain respects, they've changed a tremendous amount. But the regime is still authoritarian. It's essentially repressive. It's really an alternative model to ours, a challenge to our model of how the state should be organized and how it should behave. And it's a very challenging model because it's so effective. It works. They're doing very, very well. So what is the threat? This is my first part is about the current state of affairs, and now I want to bring that part of the analysis to a conclusion by saying, in all of this picture that I've drawn, where's the threat to the United States? People talk about three areas of threat, I think. The first is economic, the second is military, and the third is kind of political/values. The economic area, I don't see it really as a threat, and I think this is in the nature of economics. Economics is a system or process that has to do with mutual benefit and has to do as well with competition. And we see those things happening with China. We have just tremendous amount of mutual benefit. I don't have time to run through all of it, but I think that there are so many ways in which what we buy from China benefits us, what we sell from China benefits us, and they're holding our dollar, our treasury bills benefits us. And so, not speaking of them, I've already covered how much it benefits them, but that we have benefited strictly economically on a dollar, not talking about the larger strategy, but just the direct economic benefit. At the same time, of course, there's competition. The economy is a moving target all the time. As countries evolve, they have to adjust. They move from one field to another. And so I totally acknowledge that damage is done to various sectors in the United States, not so much by China, but by the transition of the economy, by the rising cost of labor here, by the growing competitiveness of many economies around the world. And so this thing that's politely called transition takes place, where some people are thrown out of work and have, the job market has to readjust. I don't consider that as a threat. I consider that as an inevitable process in a globalized economy that China joined. It didn't create it. It didn't make the rules. Does China violate the rules of the WTO? I would say they violate some rules, especially the intellectual property rights protections. But this is the way also that the WTO works. The United States also has been accused of violating some of the rules of the WTO. Most countries are accused by some trading partner at some point of time in violating the rules of the WTO. But in large part, China has complied. They've lowered their tariff barriers to what they said that they would, for example, and their imports have increased by a tremendous amount. So I would say that they comply more or less approximately as much as anybody else. What about this very controversial issue of the currency? My interpretation of that is that they never set out to possess trillions of dollars in American currency. They got stuck with it, really, because we were running a huge trade deficit, really. The root of the problem lies in our trade deficit, and they are holding these dollars that they got through selling us products that we wanted on credit, in effect, and now the dollars are not very good to hold because they have so much foreign exchange they can't invest it in high yield, which would be high risk investments. They do a little bit of that, but there's too much of it to do that. So they're holding them in treasury bills which don't produce a great return, and they can't dump those treasury bills without hurting their own interests. And actually, they're kind of stuck. So there's this Lord Keynes, I think it was. If you listen to the radio interview that I did, I already used this joke there, but I'll use it again. Lord Keynes said something like, if you owe your banker $1,000, you're in trouble, but if you owe him $1 million, he's in trouble. And the Chinese find themselves trapped with these dollars, and there's really nothing they can do with them, I think, that will hurt us. What about the military threat from China? The Chinese military absolutely is building up, but remember what I said about the challenges that they face internally as well as all around their borders. They have to deal with, whenever you do military buildup, you're planning for contingencies that may not happen. You can't say now in China that, our relations with Japan, with Central Asia, with India are okay, so we're going to dissolve our military. You have to continue to be prepared for contingencies all around the border that are credible, they are imaginable. A war in Korea, that's very, very easy to imagine. I hope it doesn't happen, but we can't say that it won't. A war in the Taiwan Strait is very possible. Naval clashes with Japan are very, very possible. Naval clashes with Vietnam, with India are possible. Border conflict with India, their unsettled border, large strategic unsettled border areas with India. Central Asia disorder, breakdown of a regime there, possibly the need for China to intervene or to protect its borders. You have to run a large military. Because of their dependency on seaborne oil and other resources coming to them by sea. They're extremely dependent on the sea lanes of communication, as they're called, these roadways that the shipping goes on, which go through, if they're coming from Europe or the Middle East, they go through the Indian Ocean, where the Indian Navy is dominant along with the U.S. They go through the Strait of Malacca, where the states on the littoral of that strait are in charge. They go through the South China Sea, where the U.S. Navy is the dominant navy. So the Chinese must, if they're going to be responsible for their own security and not depend on the Americans and the Indians, build up their navy. Does that present a threat to us? There have been incidents. Whenever there's change like that and new navies and new air forces patrolling in international areas, there are going to be some incidents, and those have occurred between the U.S. and China, between China and Japan. But I don't see it as a threat. I can imagine in 10, 15 years, Chinese ships patrolling off the coast of the United States, West Coast, and of Latin America, collecting intelligence, doing undersea, all the things that we have been doing for decades and decades right off the coast of China. I don't consider that a threat because I don't think they can use that force against us unless we lay down our arms and just say, well, we're cashing it all in. But as long as we continue to upgrade our own military, what I see is adjustment. I see small incidents, but I don't see a Chinese plan to throw military power across the ocean at us or in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. So I don't really see a threat there. I see change and adjustment. On the political and values area, I do see quite a challenge from China. They have this new model, this authoritarian market authoritarianism, it's been called, resilient authoritarianism, it's been called. They're very proud. They're enjoying quite a run of success as a type of regime. And many other regimes around the world are looking at China and saying, we don't have to do it the way that the Americans do it. If you remember back to the end of the Cold War, when Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, where he basically said that the long-standing ideological debate over whether liberal capitalism is the best or something else is the best has been settled forever, and democratic capitalism has been proven to be the best system in the world. Today, not a lot of both governments and people around the world question that. They look at how our system functions and sort of results that it produces and how the Chinese system functions, and they don't find that comparison so encouraging. I'm encouraged when I have Chinese students who come over and study in Columbia, and they do get infected with the idea of the academic freedom, and they like that. You know, human beings are always human beings, but they still often think, well, you know, that's fine, academic freedom, but it should be kept academic. And they're still quite loyal to their own political system. So I believe that the values threat, if you will, the issue of human rights, the issue of our own values, has been opened again, and that it's not necessarily the case that our values are going to sweep the whole world, and that everybody will want to be like us, and that I think we have to get back into that game much more actively than we have been doing, both in diplomacy and in public diplomacy and in our own behavior at home, to make the case. The Chinese play this diplomatic game, for example, in the international human rights institutions very, very energetically and professionally, and we don't. So I don't see a Chinese threat in the current time in the area of econ and military, but I do see it in the area of political and values. But what about the future? I mean, things are always changing. China's on the upswing. Their economy is still growing at whatever, 10 to 11% a year. They're building up their military. Do you come to a time when the curve of China overtakes the curve of the United States, and there's a kind of tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell calls it? And so that's maybe. I mean, anything is possible. But if you bear down and look a little bit more concretely at the circumstances, it seems to me that in the foreseeable future, I don't see that kind of game-changing change taking place. But so much of it depends on our own behavior. If we keep our economy growing, modernize our military, and keep ahead in science and technology. And I have to say, as a university professor, I obviously have a vested interest in this, but my former provost at Columbia named Jonathan Cole has just published a big, thick book on the American Research University, where he makes a very detailed argument about how important the great research universities really are to the vitality of the American system in many ways, and I think we're at risk of letting that go, letting our whole educational system degrade. So a lot depends on us, but if you turn the spotlight back on China and we ask, what could happen with China? And I'll just try to quickly address where are the most likely changes around China. They're not necessarily favorable to China. So with respect to the regime at home within the first ring that I talked about, this is a regime that's very strong, it's in power, it's a resilient regime, but at the same time it has some Achilles heels, it has some weaknesses, and those are the same security problems that I mentioned to you at the very beginning of my remarks. That is to say that the control over the population is basically through repression and through performance, the regime telling the public, hey, we're doing it, we're raising your standard of living. And that does work. But when they hit a big pothole, which may or may not happen at some particular time in the future, if their economic growth for whatever reason hits a big pothole and they don't perform, there is always in China the risk of a kind of deflation, a runaway collapse of popular support for the regime, which we actually did see something very much like that back in 1989 with the Tiananmen pro-democracy movement. That risk is there. If they went through what we have been through recently, where our economy tanks and we're engaged into what at one point in time seemed to be losing wars overseas, I don't think that they would just be able to turn around and elect, as we did, a new president to just keep on keeping on. I think they would have a serious political crisis. They may then have a tremendous amount of trouble, and their growth and their political stability could be interfered with. If you look around in the periphery of China, the second and third rings, there are many unstable areas around them where bad things could happen. North Korea could collapse. You could have many scenarios taking place there. It could be a war, it could be refugees, it could be just a terrible turmoil, and China would be affected because China's on the border and many North Koreans would flow across the border, or China might be drawn into a war. There could be a war around the issue of Taiwan. I don't see that as imminent, but on the other hand, the Taiwan problem hasn't been solved, and the PRC and the U.S. continue to prepare themselves in case there's any military clash. These regimes in Central Asia are very insecure. China could be drawn in. China has a big investment in Pakistan. That's an insecure situation there. So China could be drawn in, and it might come out of such an event with more influence or perhaps less in that region, but it would be very costly to China. Another challenge right around the periphery is that India is rising. India is very ambitious. India has a strong sense of its own. If we did a lecture on India, it also has a periphery that happens to include Tibet and Burma and other areas of concern to China. So the Indians are not going away, and they're growing. Their economy is growing, and actually their population is growing so that their population will actually become larger than that of China in another, I think, 30 or so years from now. So China's future changes around China are more likely, I think, to damage the interests of China and put a kink in their development trajectory than to give a favorable boost. And as long as we are still in the game, then we would be the beneficiary, more than likely, of any setback that China suffers in terms of the relative power balance. Besides this, and here's where I'll be ending up pretty much on time, I think, which is unusual for a college professor. There are some long-term changes, sort of quiet changes taking place that also present severe challenges to China. One is the aging of its population. Under Mao, they began this one-child policy. And the one-child policy has been enforced quite strictly until very, very recently, and it's only now being slightly relaxed. And the result of that is that China's population is aging, and the age balance, I don't have the numbers, I'm not too good with numbers, but they're going to have a population which is much more heavily weighted on the elderly side than will be in the future, say in 20 years from now, than will be the populations of India or the United States. The Indian population will be at that time not only approaching and then overtaking the Chinese population in size, but will be much younger, which means that the Indian economy has, if you will, a kind of latent, built-in growth spurt that's coming up, even if they mismanage, which they have done in the past, mismanage their economy, although they've now started to manage it very well. So India may very well overtake China in population size, with all that that means for GNP. I mean, just a large population boosts your GNP. And with the youth of it, which also means productivity. And the American population, because of our population structure and because of immigration as well, also will remain, relatively speaking, in a favorable balance of young and old. So this is a long-term trend which is basically inevitable. There's no place for China to really make up for this the age structure can't be fixed. It's an inevitability, which is going to, I think, generally be deleterious to China's power. A second problem coming along that I think will hurt China is climate change. I think that as climate change takes place, the impact of it on different countries will be different, and I believe that China will be one of the ones more severely affected, partly because they have a severe water shortage already, and a lot of their water comes down off of the Tibetan Plateau, melting glaciers and here there's debate among scientists, and I'm just a consumer anyway, but my understanding is that at some point the existing water shortage, which is very severe in China, particularly North China, will be worse because of climate change. And at the same time, their large coastal area, which happens to be extremely thickly populated, will be very severely affected by rising ocean levels. Now, the U.S. and everybody else will also suffer, but I think the U.S. and Europe, those countries that are already privileged with advanced economies, are going to suffer less from climate change than China. And I think India will suffer less, and so this will, again, slow the growth of China. The third area is the technological revolution. I guess I've already covered that in the sense that the Chinese are working very, very hard and impressively to get ahead of the curve, to build up their universities, to invest by the government in certain cutting-edge areas of research. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times talks about this a lot. They're talking about energy-efficient technology, but also nanotechnology, biotechnology. And here's an area where trends at the moment are favoring them unless we get back into the game. So I want to conclude by saying maybe two things. We used to worry about the Japan threat, if you remember. Japan bought the land under Rockefeller Center. That was a big moment for us in New York. And we worried that the Japanese were taking us over. Before that, we worried about the Soviet threat. There was this movie called The Russians Are Coming. So it seems that we're always worrying about some threat, and today the threat is China, but I think we need to, calm down and recognize that, that the future, that the problems faced by China are difficult. The future faced by China is quite difficult, and not worry so much about, we should always worry, but not worry so very much about China. That would be my first point. And I think the second point is to say that we need to pull up our own socks, get our house in order, that the threat, that the rise of China taken alone is more of a good thing for us than a bad thing. The thing that's dangerous about the rise of China isn't the rise of China, but the potential decline of the United States. And we have to worry more about ourselves than we do about them. And the good news of that is that we have a lot more control over our own destiny than we have over theirs. And so I would bring it back to Missoula and say that we should do a good job in our own economy and in our own society, and then I think we don't have to worry too much. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Nathan. What we're going to have now is a question and answer period. Since this will be podcast on the President's Lecture Series website, if you have a question, please come up to one of the two microphones, neither of which I can see here because of the lights, but I know that they're there. And then we will take turns with people at there. So come up, please, if you have a question to the mics, and address your question to Professor Nathan. Can you see anything?
Yeah, I see somebody.
You
ready?
Okay. All right.
I'd like to ask you to talk a bit more about Chinese policy on climate change.
On climate change.
Uh-huh. Couple of things, and then do what you'd like with it. One is, given the concerns that you briefly referred to that China has with climate change, wouldn't it? Do the policymakers yet define it as a security threat? And then another thing would be going forward in the ongoing negotiations post-Copenhagen, particularly looking towards Mexico. What do you think it's going to take for the Chinese to be willing to make a deal?
I think that the Chinese leadership is only just learning about climate change. I really don't have any inside or detailed info on this, but my guess is they're learning about it as we have been, kind of slowly, and that I think they are moving toward. They have a very good technocratic system of advisors that they really are, and they work by consensus. I think that they're moving toward defining it as a security threat. However, climate change has this special characteristic that no country can solve it by itself. So then it becomes, because if China itself reduces its emissions and other people don't, then they're going to suffer the same as if they had done nothing. And so it becomes a question of coordination. It becomes a question of this kind of prisoner's dilemma, or the free rider. Who's going to pay how much? And fixing climate change is going to be a question of costs, as I think, there are benefits in it as well. The benefits of clean energy, of energy efficiency, the new industries that will arise, which they are moving very, very fast to seize that advantage. But this cost side of it, the cost of scrubbers of smokestacks, and all those things, somebody has to pay. So I think the whole global system is in the stage of negotiating the distribution of costs. And that will take a while to negotiate. And I would say the Chinese and many other developing countries have come to the table with an argument that says, you people broke it, you fix it, which has quite a lot of moral logic to it. And the United States answer basically is, we're all in this boat together. We have to have a realistic plan. So I think what it's going to take really is just a long, and there are trust issues as well, verification issues that nobody has a full answer to. So I just think, to answer your question, what it will take, it's going to take quite a lot of hard negotiation to come to a distribution of costs that, all the main parties can accommodate, because in each country where measures are taken, like the gas tax, if it's going to be a gas tax in the United States, for example, the public will scream, like the Greek public is screaming today, about its readjustment. And the Chinese public is capable as well, as I've developed in my remarks, of screaming very loudly. So the Chinese government can't afford to kind of give away the whole store for this issue. They really have to come up with a tolerable level of cost. So I see this problem as solvable in principle, but there's so many parties to the negotiation, and it's only started, that I think it's just going to be a very long negotiating process. Somebody's over there, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I do remember Richard Nixon. People need to know if their president is a crook. That guy. My question to you, sir, is in China there must be an awareness or a concern of a growing movement and feeling, sentiment, backlash, if you will, in the United States towards trade policies and the implementation of better trade policies, tariffs, embargoes, whatever we creatively come up with. So I guess my question would be, what kind of economic backlash or retaliation could the United States see from China in that regard? And what is the most important export from China to the United States?
So you're asking, what if the United States wanted to impose economic pain on China, how could we do so?
That's correct, yes.
Is that right? That's, it's a wonderful fantasy, because I think, in fact, the business, the forces within the American economy that would oppose the infliction of any trade sanctions on China are dominant. We may not see that now because they're kind of quiet. But the idea in the Congress of putting real sanctions on China, there's no support, because every state, every congressional district is to some important way dependent upon exports to China, investment in China. So this will never happen. But if we want to dream about it's happening, I'm tempted to say that the best thing we could do to hurt China would be to inflate the dollar. They're holding all these dollars. But in terms of a trade embargo on China, they export so many things to us. There's not one single major export to the United States from China. It's all these consumer goods in Walmart. So I think it's very hard to answer that. I mean, the question is very interesting just because it's so hard to think of an answer to it. Steve, you're supposed to call on people.
I can't see people.
I can't see them either. Is there anybody over there? We're supposed to switch sides, but okay, there's somebody over here.
The theme of this meeting is China a threat to the U.S.? And you said on the values front that it was. To what level is that confrontation going to rise? Could it ever match the values competition between the Soviet Union and the U.S. earlier in the century, or will it be less confrontational than that?
That's a great question. The difference in the Cold War, I think, was that the Soviets were actively promoting their model around the world, and they had a socialist bloc, and they would meet and coordinate policies, and then they had pro-Soviet parties that they funded and trained around the world. And the Chinese are not promoting their model, and in a certain sense, that's even part of their model. They're saying every country can have its own system. We have no blueprint, which is quite different, by the way, from U.S. policy, which is one of promoting our model. We have the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, the various great foundations, George Soros's Open Society Institute, and so forth. And we talk about the need for, Zimbabwe or this country or that country to have an honest election. It's not only us, but the Europeans promoting our model. China doesn't promote its model, but what it says to a Mugabe, say, in Zimbabwe, or to a Chavez in Venezuela, or al-Bashir in the Sudan, or to the people in Iran, what they're saying openly is, we don't care what your political system is. You're the legitimate government. We want a relationship with you, and we're willing to enter into various contracts and give you aid and build roads. But what they're also saying kind of unofficially is, look at how we run our country. We don't do the stuff that the Americans do. We don't let the internet just be free and open. We don't have independent media. And look, it works fine. And people have said for many years, if you don't let the internet be completely free, your economy cannot develop. That turns out to be false. If you don't have a completely free media, you'll never be able to develop your economy, because you have to have free information to develop your economy. They're demonstrating that these inevitabilities are not true. And so I think that is, it's a very different form of competition from the Soviet model, but I take it very seriously. Thank you.
It's on, but there we go. Too close. I was going to touch on your comment as well on the Western values, and something that you noticed when your students, Chinese students, returned back. That was an area that was still a pretty significant concern. How do we as a nation, what type of changes do you think we need to try to make to address that issue? And then a second question, since you kind of touched on values earlier, would be transparency from an investment standpoint within their corporations is still a major issue. Do you see any reforms within the country coming in that area? Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think it would be important for us to, these things are probably pie in the sky. As Steve mentioned at the beginning, I do some activism in the human rights movement with Human Rights in China and some other organizations, so take it for what it's worth. But my belief is that the United States should, for example, ratify the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We should, in the International Criminal Court treaty, we should join the regime that basically we, created at the beginning. And we should obey that regime. We shouldn't engage in torture and secret disappearances. And so we should set a model in our foreign policy. And then I think that we should be much more active in the international human rights diplomacy, where the Chinese send very well-briefed and smart teams to the various meetings that take place in Geneva of different UN organizations that handle human rights. And they just roll us because we don't prepare, our diplomats don't think it's very important, we don't prepare the multilateral ground, we don't prepare our brief. We basically don't believe that it matters, and I think that it does matter. I think, thirdly, that our government, although we have a lot of important interests and agenda items with China, whether it's the economy, whether it's North Korea, Iran, and all these big security issues, I think that we've downgraded the human rights issue much too low, that it's important that our President and Secretary of State aggressively address that issue. There are plenty of human rights violations in China that need to be addressed, and we should put a stronger priority on it in our diplomacy. Those are some of the examples, but I think as well that, now this very much, I'm supposed to be a specialist, talking as a specialist, but the next and last point I want to make to answer the question that you just raised is that right now our own domestic political system is not working very well, it seems to me, and somehow we have to get beyond that if we're going to impress the rest of the world. You saw, or I saw in the New York Times, I don't know if you saw it, a picture of Ukrainian legislators fighting, and I think that the picture of our Senate that is given to the rest of the world is, all but the same, and that it's not a good picture. Now, on your thing about the transparency, this is something that I don't, first of all, don't really know much about, but I would say that it's very diverse. So if you're talking about listings of Chinese companies on the stock exchange, for example, I think there's a real transparency problem with those listings, and there are a lot of lawyers, Western or Western-trained lawyers and law firms in China and investment banks and others working out of Hong Kong, for example, that are really pushing that with these companies that want to list or that want to, to sell stocks, pushing that transparency issues. I have a former student who's a pretty high-ranking banker in a Western bank in Hong Kong who deals with the China market, and when a company hires his bank and they want to list or to sell stock, this guy who is Chinese goes into them and he says, you got to obey, for example, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange rules. And the Chinese guy who maybe came up from the village and doesn't, has become very wealthy, tells my friend, we're going to fudge this and fudge that. And my friend tells him, no, I'm walking away. We're not dealing with you. I mean, so he just drops the client because he cannot, prosper in Hong Kong by conniving with these kinds of things. So it's a kind of a ground war. It's a kind of a ground game, to sort of move the practice of Chinese companies. Some of these Chinese companies are incredibly sophisticated and international. A lot of the upcoming rich companies are just these country guys who have no idea what the rules are. So I would say it's very diverse, which I suppose is a kind of cop-out answer. I told you at the beginning, I don't know, and I give you a long speech that ends up saying it's diverse, which is the same thing as saying that I don't know. We have somebody, yes.
Thank you, Professor, for managing to cover with your speech a number of very complicated subjects and to simplify them. One of the questions I wanted to raise to you, and also as a potential opportunity, and for myself just as a novice just following the automotive markets, is whether China itself could be able to follow the models of Japan and to a lesser degree South Korea of joint ventures of manufacturing, and more particular in automotive manufacturing engineering, in sustainable engineering of electric vehicles and obviously the hybrids. And if all of us were to consider back in the 70s that we'd be owning Japanese vehicles of very high quality, and to a lesser extent joint ventures where the automotive industries would be reliant on Japanese manufacturers to be building Japanese vehicles, and to a lesser degree South Korean vehicles here in the US, whether China itself could follow those models within a relatively short period of time.
I think they definitely can. They're certainly aiming to do so. The Chinese car industry started to modernize. When, I forget exactly, when was Beijing Jeep? Late 70s, early 80s. And they've gone very deeply into joint ventures with Chrysler, with GM, with VW, and they have proven themselves adept at learning the technology, and they are Chery, a Chinese car company, bought, what did they buy? I forget. And they're definitely planning to go into the international market. And I don't see any reason why they can't build cars at the prevailing level of quality and become very big in the international market. Yes.
My memory of Richard Nixon begins with something that rings pretty hollowly now. My wife wears a good Republican cloth coat. I think there are a lot of us out here who remember that. I have the feeling, and I can't sort it out, and I wonder if you have any insight into it, that this whole episode with Google, perhaps including the suggestion that there was some pretty serious espionage at the base of the dispute and Google's decision to back out of mainland China, augurs for more problems than you've really raised so far. And I just can't sort out whether I think that was a real event whose import we'll only see, in time. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that Google, maybe three thoughts. Google was not realizing its business plan in China because it was facing unfair competition from local companies that were aided by the government. So I think that's one reason why they pulled out, and it does speak to the difficulty of operating in the Chinese environment. I don't think that what the Chinese were doing violated any WTO or other commitments, but it does suggest that they are very, very competitive, that the state is concerned about using all means that are consistent with their international obligations to protect the Chinese economy. So that's one theme there that I think made it attractive for Google to pull out. Secondly, the cyber espionage is a very prevalent thing. It's done by all the advanced governments. And if I'm a taxpayer, and I certainly hope that our government is doing a lot of cyber espionage. I know I'm paying for it. And so the Chinese are doing it also, and I think we should expect that. I think the Israelis are doing it. I think the French are doing it. I don't know if the Japanese are doing it, but they ought to be doing it. And we know that the Russians are doing it, but the Chinese are very, very good at it, partly because they have a huge manpower. I mean, they're very good in computer stuff. This is one of the areas in which they've invested, and they have a vast manpower invested in this area, and electronic warfare, which includes cyber espionage, but also many, many other forms of electronic warfare, like potentially taking down the other side's command and control system, apparently is what they view as one of their potential advantages. Their military in general is behind our military. We have, I think, 7 aircraft carrier battle groups. I forget how many. They have 0. Our space warfare is far more advanced. Our missile warfare is far more advanced. We're more advanced in many areas, but this is an area where they think that they can catch up and sort of overleap. So yes, I think they're invested in that. I said I had 3 points, but the third point, I thought I might connect that to the human rights issue. This is an example where I think China's violation of human rights is connected to a concrete disadvantage for the United States. human rights principles, including freedom of speech, freedom of information, and so forth, haven't been worked out in detail as they apply to the internet, and yet I think the overarching application of those things to the internet is pretty clear, that the internet should be as free as, at least as free as other media. And China controls its internet, as you know, and part of the Google claim was the violation of privacy of Google clients who were using Google as their internet, whatever the noun is that you use there, their service provider, right? Thank you. Lucky I have you. Come over here so I can ask you other questions. And you know, so I think if we don't protest at the Chinese violating human rights on the internet, we're giving away, you know, something that's actually very important to us individually and as a society. Okay.
Are you going to allow another question? Well, there was some discussion here of China perhaps challenging the dominance of the United States in the world. But I have imagined that the world was moving toward an era of multipolarism, rather more like pre-First World War situation, where the disputes were not ideological, but simply raw power and economic dominance. And I'm also assuming that this multipolar world will be one in which the international institutions will, as in the past, remain relatively ineffectual. And so should that sort of thing occur, is there any particular reason to think that the United States and China would be the leaders of opposite competing groups, or is there any reason why it should come out that way rather than some completely different pattern?
Yeah, very, very good question. I agree that it's not taking shape as an ideological battle. The United States, I would say, is an ideological power. That is to say that we promote, you know, a vision of values and of human society. But China is intentionally not positioning itself as an ideological power. Its only ideology really is mutual respect for sovereignty and mutual interest, which is a kind of ideology of no ideology. So it's not taking that shape. I think that as, you know, that the abnormal situation of American primacy at the end of the Cold War couldn't last, and that multipolarity really is, which is a rather vague term, but it just means that the United States can't have it all its way, that it has to consult and negotiate and bargain with China, India, Japan, the EU, and other powers. I do think that's the state of affairs. Now, your question, is there any reason why it has to, are you saying, and I think that the security problems of China that I described, the first and second and third and fourth rings, that none of those security needs of China is in and of itself adverse to the security of the United States. It doesn't hurt us if China is politically stable. It doesn't hurt us if China is able to stabilize its relations with its neighboring countries. It doesn't really hurt us if China is acquiring oil, I don't think, and other resources. I know there's some thought that there's only so much oil and we need to have it all and nobody else can have it, but we don't think about that when the Japanese or the Europeans consume oil or gas. I don't see why it hurts us if the Chinese consume resources, much of which they are consuming to produce products for export to us. I think that there is a compatibility at a very high level of generality of Chinese security and our security, but when it comes to any concrete issue like climate change, who pays? Or Korea, when the whole Korean thing sorts itself out, and who knows when, either the US will be the dominant foreign power in the Korean peninsula or China will. It's not likely to be both. So I think in many more examples that I could give. The macro picture is one of potential congruency of security, but the day-to-day picture is one of competition and adjustment. I'm not sure if I've answered your question. When I heard your question, I thought it was great, but by the time I got into the answer, I forgot the exact way that you had put it.
No, I think that you answered in a very reassuring way.
Yeah.
This notion that these two powers would be clashing necessarily was nowhere in what you were saying before.
Right. I have
I
a
believe that
former
was the
student
case.
named Robert Ross who wrote an article called The Geography of the Peace in the journal International Security. If you want to be reassured some more before you go to bed tonight, go onto the internet and get this article. But Ross points out that, China and the U.S. are rather far away from each other, and we're separated by an ocean. And moreover, that the United States is fundamentally a maritime power, and China is fundamentally a continental power. And in some very broad strategic sense, there isn't any reason why we can't. If you think about China and Japan, it's very hard to see how both of them can be militarily secure at the same moment. They're so close together. They're both have very, very urgent needs to control their maritime environment and to control each other, but neither one is willing to be controlled by the other. It's a kind of scorpions in a bottle situation. We are not in that same situation with China, so Bob Ross argues in a reassuring way that it is possible to live together. It's not like Germany and France, for example, who are now living together, but who for centuries, just couldn't trust one another.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.